I love you so much. We did. We did.
7 years ago, Solomon Grant buried his wife with an empty casket. He chose it himself. Dark walnut, cream lining, white roses on top, because she had once said white roses were the only flower worth the trouble. He stood at her grave in the January cold without a coat, and did not move for 40 minutes after the last mourner had gone home. He was the last person to leave her. He was always the last person to leave anything that mattered to him. He drove back to the house they had built together and sat on the kitchen floor for 2 hours without moving, without eating, without turning on a single light. When he finally got up, it was dark outside, and the city was doing its nighttime things, and nothing about that mattered to him at all. In the weeks that followed, he donated $3 million to a women's health foundation in her name. He had her portrait painted and hung it in the lobby of every building his company owned, because he wanted anyone who walked through those doors to understand that she had mattered, and that mattering did not stop when a person died. He built a hospital wing with her name above the entrance. He endowed a scholarship at the university where they had met, so that every year a young person who could not otherwise afford to be there would be there because of her. Every year on the anniversary of her death, he left work early, drove to the cemetery alone, and sat at her grave until the sun went down, talking to her photograph the way a man talks to someone he believes can still hear him. He never dated again. He never stopped grieving. He never moved her things from the reading room at the end of the apartment hallway. Her books were still on the shelves. Her cardigan was still over the back of the chair. Her novel was still face down at page 214, the page she had been reading the night she died, the page where she had set the book down to answer the phone and had never come back to it. He grieved her like a man who understood that what he had lost could not be replaced, and who had decided, without making a production of the decision, that he was not going to pretend otherwise. And she was not dead. She was alive. She was living 400 miles south in a small Tennessee town most maps did not include, in a rented house at the end of a dirt road. She drove a truck with a cracked dashboard and a radio that received 2 stations cleanly and a third one only when the weather was right. She taught 3rd grade at an elementary school with fewer than 200 students. She grew tomatoes in a garden she had planted herself in the second spring. Once she was certain the house was going to be hers for a while. She had no bank account under her real married name, no credit cards, no social media presence, no connection to any system that Solomon Grant or anyone working for him could search. She had made herself invisible with the careful, deliberate precision of a woman who understood exactly how far a powerful man's reach extended, and had placed herself just beyond the edge of it, and had stayed there for 7 years and had built, in that invisible space, a life that was more completely and fully hers than anything she had lived before. And she had 2 sons. Twin boys. 6 years old the morning Solomon found out they existed. Named Caleb and Jordan. With their father's build, their father's hands, their father's specific way of occupying space with complete physical confidence, and a mother who had raised them entirely alone on a teacher's salary in a town their father had never once heard of and would never have thought to look in. The morning Solomon Grant discovered his sons existed was the morning a routine hospital database migration flagged a volunteer intake form filled out 18 months earlier by a woman named Renata Was. The form had a date of birth that matched his dead wife exactly. It had an emergency contact named Gloria, a name Solomon knew, a name that had stood at the graveside in the rain holding his hand, a name that had been Renata's closest friend since they were 22 years old. His assistant cross-referenced the photograph on the form against the portrait in the company archive. She placed the 2 photographs side by side on his desk. She walked into his office and said his name. And 7 years of grief cracked open like an egg dropped on marble. This is not a simple story. It is the story of a man who had $400 million and could not hold on to the one thing that made having $400 million bearable. A woman who chose a cracked dashboard and a dirt road over a glass tower and a gallery of oil paintings because the glass tower had become a cage so perfectly constructed and so sincerely maintained that the only door out of it was the one she had to build herself in the dark. And 2 little boys who grew up in the space between their father's fortune and their mother's courage and became, in that space, people worth knowing. Stay with me. Nothing in this story is what it looks like from the outside. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, Ghana, South Africa, Jamaica, Australia. We read every single comment, and we love knowing where our family is. And if you are not yet subscribed to Mind Folktales, hit that button right now so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let us get into it. Solomon Grant grew up in southwest Atlanta, the only son of a city bus driver named Robert and a woman named June who cleaned office buildings downtown from 4 in the morning until noon and was home every single afternoon when Solomon came back from school, without exception, for the entirety of his childhood. They were not wealthy. They were not poor. They were the specific category of American family that is too often described by what it lacks rather than by what it has, which in Solomon's case was considerable. He had 2 parents who showed up every day for everything that required showing up. He had a father who was interested in him, genuinely interested, not performatively interested, the kind of interest that expresses itself not in expensive activities but in attention, in questions, in the willingness to sit across from a 10-year-old and actually listen to what the 10-year-old thinks about things. He had a mother who made it clear by the consistency of her presence that he was the most important appointment on her schedule and that no other appointment was going to supersede it. He grew up understanding, in the deep, cellular way that children understand things they have never been told in words, that showing up was not a strategy or a choice, but simply the baseline requirement of being a person worth knowing. He was a serious student not because anyone pressured him, but because learning was the activity that made his mind feel most like itself. He was good at mathematics with the specific, structural goodness of a person who finds in numbers not abstraction but language, a way of describing the world that was cleaner and more honest than most other ways. He was good at problem solving in the broader sense, which meant he was interested in systems, in how things worked, and why they sometimes did not work, and what would need to change for them to work better. He was elected student government president in his junior year of high school not because he was the most popular candidate, but because he was the one who, when asked at the candidates forum what he would do about the broken water fountains on the second floor, produced a 3-point plan instead of a slogan. He won by 11 votes. He put himself through Georgia Tech on a combination of academic scholarship, student loans, and a weekend job at a logistics warehouse, where he spent 4 years loading and unloading trucks from midnight to 6 in the morning and then going directly to campus for 8 o'clock class. He never once described this period of his life as difficult. He described it as foundational, by which he meant that it taught him the specific, unglamorous truth that the difference between people who build things and people who talk about building things is not intelligence or talent, but the willingness to do the work when the work is hard and unglamorous and nobody is watching. He graduated with a degree in industrial engineering, took a position at a small healthcare operations consulting firm, and spent 3 years learning the shape of the industry he was going to spend the next 20 years working inside. He started his own company at 32. It was a healthcare technology firm focused on operational efficiency in community and regional hospitals, the hospitals that served working class and rural populations and that were chronically under-resourced in ways that translated directly into worse outcomes for the patients who needed the best outcomes the most. He had 3 employees, an office above a dry cleaner, a business plan that was 12 pages long, and a conviction so complete and so specific that it had no room inside it for the possibility of failure. He worked 17 hours a day for the first 3 years and considered this neither heroic nor remarkable, but simply what the situation required. By the time he was 40, the company had been acquired at a valuation that made him financially secure for the rest of his life. He was, at 40, a wealthy man. He was, at 40, also a man who had spent his entire adult life in motion and who had, in that motion, accumulated everything that a life can be measured by and had not yet found the thing that made the measuring feel worthwhile. And then he met Renata. Solomon had one close friend across his entire adult life, a man named Darius who had known him since they were 19 years old, and who had earned the designation of close friend not through the performance of loyalty, but through its consistent, undramatic practice over 3 decades. Darius called every Sunday regardless of whether Solomon answered. He showed up when things were bad without being asked. He said true things even when true things were uncomfortable, which was a quality Solomon valued above almost all others in a person, because Solomon had been surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear for long enough that he had developed a precise and reliable ability to recognize the alternative. When Renata died, Darius drove to Atlanta and sat with Solomon in the kitchen for 2 days without leaving and without saying much of anything, because he understood that some things do not require words and that the presence of a person who loves you is its own form of speech. He said, in the second year of Solomon's grief, over a dinner that neither of them ate much of, "You are the saddest man I have ever loved, and I am not going anywhere." Solomon had kept those 2 sentences close ever since. They were among the most useful things anyone had ever said to him. Solomon had a specific relationship with silence that most people in his professional life never understood. He was not a quiet man in the social sense. He could work a room, hold a boardroom, command the attention of 50 people without effort. But he had learned early, from his father, that the most important information in any situation was almost never the loudest information. His father had driven a city bus for 31 years and had, in that time, developed a precise and reliable read of people that he described not as intelligence, but as paying attention. He had told Solomon once, when Solomon was about 14, and had come home from school agitated about a conflict with a classmate that he was certain he was right about. Before you decide you are right, sit with the possibility that you are not. Not to be humble, to be accurate. Solomon had carried this. It had made him a better businessman than his formal education had. It had also made him, in the marriage, the specific kind of man who believed so completely in the accuracy of his own assessment that he had stopped applying the discipline his father had taught him to the one domain where it mattered most. He understood this clearly now. He had understood it since the 3rd year of therapy, when Dr. Whitman had asked him to sit with the possibility that every decision he had made in the marriage that he believed was correct had been made from inside a framework he had never examined. A framework that placed his judgment above Renata's by default, that treated his certainty as the end of a question rather than the beginning of a conversation. He had sat with this for a long time. He had found it accurate. He had continued to sit with it, not because sitting with it was comfortable, but because his father had taught him that accuracy mattered more than comfort, and he had decided, at 51 years old on a porch in Tennessee, that it was past time to apply that lesson to himself. The work Solomon had done in the years of grief was not visible work. It produced no audience. It generated no recognition. He went to therapy every week and said difficult things about himself to a woman who was not impressed by his money or his reputation and who was interested only in whether he was telling the truth. He read research that described his behavior in clinical terms and sat with the reading without managing it into something easier to live with. He called Gloria. He restructured the company. He built the hospital wing and endowed the scholarship not as performances of grief, but as real acts in the world that produced real outcomes for real people. Because that was what she had cared about, and he was not going to honor her memory with gestures when actual work was available. He went to the cemetery every anniversary not because it helped him, but because she had deserved the showing up, and he was going to keep showing up regardless of whether it helped. None of this made him a different man in the clean, cinematic sense of a man who has been reformed and is ready for redemption. It made him a man who understood, with increasing clarity and specificity, exactly what he had done and what it had cost, and what the work of accounting for it looked like in the specific, ongoing, unglamorous daily terms that actual change requires. He was not reformed. He was working. There is a difference, and it is important, and it was, as it turned out, exactly the distinction Renata had been watching for. Renata Was grew up in Atlanta, the only child of Ghanaian immigrants who had built their American life on 2 premises that they treated as equally non-negotiable. The first was that their daughter's education was not an advantage to be pursued when convenient, but an obligation to be fulfilled completely. The second was that fulfilling it completely meant not just producing a person who was credentialed and employable, but producing a person who understood why the credential mattered, what the work was for, who it was supposed to serve. Her father, Emmanuel, had spent 23 years as a civil engineer for the city of Atlanta working on the infrastructure that held the city up: roads, bridges, drainage systems, the invisible architecture of urban life that nobody thinks about when it functions and everyone notices when it does not. He had never described his work as glamorous. He had described it as necessary, which in his understanding was a higher category. Her mother Abina had taught French at a public high school for 27 years and had the specific, warm, demanding quality of the best teachers, which is the quality of believing that every student in the room is capable of more than they currently believe about themselves, and being willing to act on that belief every single day regardless of the evidence the world occasionally produces to the contrary. Renata absorbed both of her parents completely. She had her father's precision, his refusal to approximate when exactness was available, his specific impatience with things that were built incorrectly when they could have been built correctly with equal effort. She had her mother's warmth and her mother's conviction that the purpose of knowing things was to do something useful with the knowing. She was not arrogant. She was honest. She knew what she knew and she knew what she did not know, and she had zero patience for pretending either was different from what it was. This quality was, in her childhood and her education and her professional life, enormously useful. It was also, in certain social contexts, slightly alarming to people who had not encountered it before. She went to Spelman College on a partial academic scholarship and worked 2 jobs to cover the rest. She was not bitter about this and did not describe it as a hardship. It was the arrangement available to her, and she executed it with the same methodical competence she brought to every arrangement. She studied public health because she had grown up watching her mother navigate the American healthcare system with the specific, informed frustration of a woman who understood exactly how it was failing the people around her. Failing them not through malice, but through the accumulated inefficiency of systems designed by people who did not have to live inside their consequences. Renata had decided at 17 that she was going to spend her professional life on that gap. She graduated from Spelman with honors, completed a master's in health administration at Emory in 2 years, and walked out of the program with a precise, urgent, completely non-abstract intention to close the distance between what the system promised and what it actually delivered. She spent her 20s building things that worked. She was a program coordinator at a nonprofit healthcare access organization for 3 years, built 3 programs that produced measurable outcomes in that time, was promoted to program director, spent 2 more years expanding the operation, and by the time she was 30 was running a regional community health access network covering 4 counties with a staff of 12 and a budget she had expanded from $800,000 to $3.2 million by writing grant applications that were simply the best grant applications the relevant funders had ever received. She was not interested in programs that generated good press or satisfied reporting requirements. She was interested in programs that changed outcomes for specific people in specific places. These 2 categories overlap less than the nonprofit sector would prefer to believe, and Renata had known this since she was 24 and had organized her entire professional practice around acting on the knowledge. She was 28 when she met Solomon Grant at a healthcare innovation conference in Atlanta. He was 35, already wealthy, and had the specific quality that very successful people sometimes have of generating a kind of atmospheric gravity when they entered a room, a sense that things happening near them were more significant than things happening elsewhere. Renata noticed this quality in the first 30 seconds and was entirely unimpressed by it, because she had spent a decade working alongside powerful people and had found that power was consistently the least interesting thing about most of them. What she could not dismiss was what happened 20 minutes into their conversation. He asked her a direct question about the structural weaknesses in his company's new community health initiative, and when she gave him a direct answer identifying 3 specific problems he had not seen, he did not defend himself, did not reframe, did not redirect toward his strengths. He listened. He asked 2 follow-up questions that demonstrated he had genuinely processed what she said. Then he said, "Will you have dinner with me tonight and tell me the rest?" She said, "I have told you all of it." He said, "Then have dinner with me anyway." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "You are paying." He said, "Obviously." They dated for a year. Renata was not a person who moved quickly on things that mattered, and whether to be with Solomon Grant mattered enormously. And so she took her time and watched carefully and looked for what was actually there beneath the surface of what he presented. She found him to be what he appeared, genuinely intelligent in the structural sense she respected, genuinely attentive in the rare and specific way that makes a person feel that what they are saying is being heard rather than managed, capable of being wrong and capable of saying so. She found no evidence of anything else. She said yes when he asked. They were married in the spring of the following year. Her father gave a speech that made 7 men cry who had never cried at a wedding before. Her best friend Gloria gave a toast that Renata had to look at the ceiling during to keep her face in order. It was a right beginning. For 4 years it remained a right marriage. Renata's relationship with her parents was one of the most significant relationships of her life, and also one of the most significant losses of the decision she made in March. She had disappeared from two people who loved her completely, who had built their American lives around the premise of her future, who had sat in the front row at her wedding and watched her say yes to a man they had believed in because she believed in him. She had disappeared from them without explanation and without the ability to give one, and she had lived with that disappearance for 7 years as the specific, ongoing cost of keeping herself and her sons safe. Her mother Abina had taught French for 27 years on the premise that language was not decoration but infrastructure, that the ability to speak another language was not a cultural luxury, but a practical tool for understanding how the world looked from a different angle, which was a skill that had more uses than most people understood until they needed it. She had pressed the Thursday French dinners on Renata from the age of 5, not because she expected Renata to use French professionally, though Renata had, occasionally, in healthcare access work with Haitian Creole-speaking communities in Atlanta, but because she wanted her daughter to understand from early in her life that difficulty was not a reason to avoid something. It was simply the condition in which certain necessary things had to be done. This was also, Renata understood now, the exact framework within which her mother had received the 2 and signed letters. Her mother had read the letters and understood their content and accepted the silence because she was a woman who understood that difficulty was the condition and not the argument against the necessary thing. Her father Emmanuel had spent 23 years building the infrastructure that held Atlanta up without anyone knowing his name. He had done this work with the specific, unglamorous dedication of a man who understood that necessity did not require recognition. The storm drain that prevented a neighborhood from flooding was necessary whether or not the neighborhood knew who designed it. The bridge bearing that kept the load from shifting was doing its job whether or not anyone noticed. He had passed this understanding to Renata completely. It was why she had been able to build 3 healthcare programs in 4 years at her first job and leave the job when a better opportunity arose without needing the programs to bear her name. It was why she had been able to build 7 years of quiet, invisible, unglamorous life in Crestwood and find in the building itself the satisfaction that other people required recognition to access. The satisfaction was in the doing. The doing was enough. Her father had told her this at 14 when she had won a science competition and been upset that the recognition was smaller than she felt the work deserved. He had said, "The work does not become better or worse depending on whether anyone is watching it. You know what you built. Build the next thing." She had carried this her entire life. She had built the next thing every time. The reunion happened 3 months after Solomon arrived. It was a Saturday. She drove to Atlanta with the boys, arrived at the house on the southwest Atlanta street where she had grown up, and her mother opened the door before she reached the porch steps. They stood on the front path for a moment and looked at each other, and the 7 years were in the space between them and also completely outside of it, the way certain kinds of time do not accumulate between people who have always known each other. Her mother said, "Look at you." That was all. They went inside. Her father shook hands with Caleb, who received this with the dignity of someone being extended appropriate professional courtesy, and then with Jordan, who held the handshake 1 beat longer than required and looked at his grandfather with the watchful, assessing quality that his grandfather immediately recognized because it was entirely his own, transmitted through his daughter to this child who stood in his hallway, holding his hand with the serious attention of a person making a real assessment of a real situation. Her father looked back at him with the same quality, and something passed between them in the handshake that required no translation. Her mother made fufu and light soup, which took most of the afternoon and filled the house with a smell that Renata had not realized she had been carrying in her memory as one of the specific, irreplaceable sensory facts of being safe. The smell of warmth and care, and a kitchen that produced sustenance as an act of love. She sat at the kitchen table while her mother cooked and her father talked to her sons in the backyard garden, and she let herself feel, all the way, the full weight of what she had missed and what she had protected by missing it. Both things were true, and she held both of them and was held by the house around her. The fault line that opened in the 5th year of their marriage did not arrive with a sound. There was no explosion, no betrayal in the conventional sense, no single event that could be pointed to and named as the moment everything changed. What there was instead was a pressure that accumulated so gradually and so quietly over years that by the time Renata understood what she was living inside, she had already been living inside it long enough that the instrument she would normally have used to assess the situation, her own perception, her own judgment, her own clear-eyed reading of the evidence in front of her, had been subtly and systematically compromised by it. It began with the work. In the first years of their marriage, Solomon had been genuinely interested in the community health division Renata ran inside the company. The interest was appropriate. He was the founder and majority shareholder, and the work mattered to both of them. He attended her presentations. He asked good questions. He was, in those first years, exactly the professional partner she had hoped he would be. In the fifth year, the quality of the interest changed. He began attending meetings she had not invited him to, always explained as staying informed, always framed as the appropriate oversight of a founder who cared about every part of the operation. He began communicating directly with her partner organizations about programs she was managing, always framed as supporting the relationship, never as overriding her authority, though the functional effect was to establish himself as the real decision-maker in those relationships. He began reviewing her program decisions before they were implemented, always explained as quality assurance, always delivered with the patient, reasonable tone of a man who was simply trying to protect an important institutional investment. She said something. He explained. The explanation was rational and confident, and completely closed to the possibility that it might be wrong. She said something a second time. He explained again. By the third time, she raised a concern about the scope of his involvement in her work and received the same patient explanation she had received twice before. She understood something she had not previously understood. The explanation was not a response to her concern. The explanation was a mechanism for resolving her concern without addressing it. He was not hearing her. He was managing her. There was a difference, and it was significant, and he genuinely could not see it. Then she found out about the finances. In the second year of their marriage, Solomon had suggested they set up a joint financial management platform for tax efficiency and household organization. She had agreed. It was a reasonable suggestion presented in reasonable terms, and she had no reason at the time to look at it more closely than the surface it presented. In the sixth year, she looked at the platform settings for the first time with genuine attention and found that it gave Solomon complete, continuous, real-time visibility into every transaction she made from any account in the household, including the personal account he had encouraged her to maintain for professional appearances. He had never mentioned this. He had simply had it, for 4 years, without disclosure. When she raised it, he said he had never specifically looked at her account, that the monitoring was automatic and structural rather than targeted, that it was a security measure for executive household management. The explanation was patient and reasonable, and she had heard the shape of it before. Then she found out about the phone call. She was having dinner with her closest friend Gloria on a Thursday evening when Gloria put down her fork and said, "Renata, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not react in front of me the way I think you are going to react." Solomon had called Gloria 2 weeks earlier. He had introduced himself as concerned about Renata. He said he had noticed that Renata was spending a significant amount of time outside the house lately, and that he was worried her social life was adding to her stress, and he wanted Gloria, as her closest friend, to be aware of this, and to be thoughtful about the demands she placed on Renata's time and energy. He had presented this as an act of love. He had done it without Renata's knowledge. He had called her closest friend to report on her social behavior, express concern about her friendships, and suggest a modification in how that friend engaged with her. And he had done all of this with the complete, sincere, unexamined confidence of a man who believed that this was simply what loving someone looked like. Renata picked up her water glass. She held it. She set it down. She said to Gloria, "I am going to finish this dinner." Gloria said, "Are you all right?" Renata said, "I need to think before I say anything." She finished the meal. She drove home. She walked into the house and Solomon looked up from his desk and smiled, and asked about dinner, and she said it was good, and she went upstairs. She lay in the dark for a long time, and she thought, with the full, clear, unsparing attention she brought to every important assessment, about the phone call, and the financial monitoring, and the program reviews, and the partner communications, and the 3 years of watching certain friendships quietly, gradually, without any single obvious cause, begin to fade. She lay in the dark, and for the first time she looked at all of it at once rather than one piece at a time. The picture that emerged from looking at all of it at once was different from the picture produced by any individual piece. Individual pieces could be explained. The pattern they made together could not. She was also, and had been for 3 weeks, 10 weeks pregnant with twins. She had discovered the pregnancy at a clinic appointment she had attended alone, paying in cash, under a name one letter different from her own. She had not told Solomon. She had been carrying this information alongside everything else she was learning, and she understood now, lying in the dark next to her sleeping husband, why some part of her had been holding it back. She was not going to raise these children inside this. She lay there and looked at the full shape of her marriage and the full shape of what was growing inside her and the full shape of what she was going to have to do. And she let it all be as large as it actually was, and she breathed, and then she began to plan. The specific texture of a controlling relationship is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not been inside one, because the most important mechanism is one that has no visible form. It is not what is said. It is the cumulative effect of what is said across hundreds of interactions over years, each individual instance explainable, each one deniable, the pattern they make together invisible until you stop looking at the pieces and look at the shape. Renata had not been able to see the shape until she drew it herself on a legal pad on a Tuesday evening in the 6th year of the marriage. She drew it by listing every instance she could recall across 3 years where Solomon had expressed concern about a friendship, every instance where he had reviewed a professional decision of hers without being asked, every instance where she had raised something and received an explanation that was more complete than a response, but less useful than an answer. She listed them all and drew lines between the categories and looked at what the lines described. What they described was a man who had, over 3 years, made himself the authority on every domain of her life, professional, social, financial, communicative, without ever issuing a single explicit directive. He had not told her who she could see or what she could buy or where she could go. He had not needed to. He had instead created, through the patient, consistent, sincerely concerned application of his own judgment to every aspect of her existence, a set of conditions in which her autonomous choices were subject to review, her perceptions of those conditions were subject to reframing, and her ability to trust her own assessment of what was happening had been gradually and thoroughly compromised. This is what the research calls coercive control. It is the most dangerous form of intimate partner harm precisely because it produces no evidence that the legal system knows how to process. No bruises. No recorded threats. No clear incidents that can be isolated and prosecuted. Just a woman standing in a kitchen in the 6th year of a marriage, looking at a piece of paper, understanding for the first time with complete clarity that she had been disappearing inside her own life and had not known it until she mapped it. She had thought about what to do with this understanding for 3 months before she made her decision. She had thought about the alternatives: therapy, separation, legal action. She was not naive about the alternatives. Therapy had been tried, in the form of 3 conversations with Solomon in which she had said what she needed to say and had received explanations so patient and so complete and so invulnerable to challenge that she had come away from each one less certain rather than more certain of her own perception. Legal action required evidence of a kind the legal system could process, which she did not have, and which the nature of what was happening to her made almost impossible to produce. Separation required resources she did not have and access to a legal framework that would be dramatically less favorable to her than to a man with Solomon's money and Solomon's legal team and Solomon's reputation in a community that had no reason to question the account he would provide. She thought about all of these alternatives carefully and honestly and arrived at the conclusion she had arrived at, and she executed it with the same complete and patient thoroughness with which she executed everything else. She had spent years in professional life being the person who said the honest thing when the honest thing was uncomfortable, who told the conference room that the initiative had 3 structural problems when everyone else was planning the launch celebration, who identified the gap between what the system promised and what it actually delivered, and said so clearly and specifically without caring whether the saying was welcome. She had spent years doing this. She had not been able to do it inside her marriage, not because she had stopped being who she was, but because the marriage had been specifically designed, not intentionally, not maliciously, but functionally, to prevent the honest thing from arriving at a surface where it could land. The explanation always arrived first. The explanation always closed the gap before the honest thing could get through it. She had not been able to find a way around the explanation within the structure of the relationship, so she had left the structure. Renata planned her escape the way she had planned every important thing in her professional life, completely, patiently, with systematic attention to every variable that could go wrong. She did not panic. She did not act from anger. She had 9 months before the twins arrived, and she used every one of them with the focused efficiency of a woman who understood that the quality of her preparation was going to determine the quality of her children's entire lives. Money was the first problem. Her personal account was monitored and insufficient. The joint account was Solomon's domain in every practical sense. She had access to less than $400 that was genuinely, independently, untraceably hers. She needed more. She began accumulating cash in increments small enough not to register against the normal variation of household expenses. Grocery returns, small surpluses from the weekly household budget managed carefully enough to produce a consistent surplus. Occasional transactions categorized as professional expenses within the range Solomon expected without review. She did this for 9 months. She accumulated $6,000. She kept it in a fireproof lockbox at the back of a closet Solomon never used, behind the winter coats. She counted it on the first Sunday evening of every month after Solomon was asleep, not because she needed to count it, but because the monthly counting was a commitment she had made to herself, and she was not going to break commitments to herself during a period in which keeping them was the most important discipline available to her. Documentation was the second problem. She needed everything that existed under her birth name. Renata Was, the name before the marriage, gathered, certified, and portable. Her health administration credentials, her educational certificates, her original identification. She obtained certified copies through a notary 40 miles from Atlanta. Visiting on days, she told Solomon she had site visits, which was true on those days in the sense that she had appointments she was treating as professional obligations. She kept everything in the lockbox. A destination was the third problem. She found the organization through a healthcare access network she had worked with before the marriage. A women's resource center in Tennessee whose director was a woman named Clara who had been doing this work for 20 years and whose voice on the phone had the specific, settled calm of someone who has heard everything and responds not with alarm, but with logistics. Renata called from a library computer using a temporary email account and described her situation in the precise, clinical terms of a public health professional documenting a case. Clara said, "We can help you. When you are ready, call this number." Renata wrote the number on a piece of paper and put it in the lockbox. The mechanism was the fourth problem. The problem with simply leaving was that a woman who simply leaves a marriage to a man with Solomon's resources and Solomon's legal reach does not stay gone. She had thought about this carefully. She had thought about what the law allowed in terms of tracking, searching, compelling disclosure. She had thought about what his money could purchase in terms of private investigation, database access, legal pressure on the people who might help her. She had thought about the specific vulnerability of a woman who disappears with her real name and her real documents into a world that was, in 2016, increasingly impossible to be invisible inside. She needed a story that closed the file completely. She needed a story that made looking pointless. The only story that did that was death. She drove a mountain route every month for site visits north of Atlanta. There was a section of that route with a compromised guardrail that the state had been scheduled to repair for 8 months and had not. The gorge below was deep. The current of the water at the bottom was documented as strong. She had noticed this section many times with the automatic, evaluative attention of a person trained to observe structural inadequacies in built environments. She observed it now with a different kind of attention. She drove past it 6 times over 3 months, at different times of day, noting the sight lines from the nearest structures, the distance to the nearest occupied property, the timing of traffic on that stretch, the physics of what a scene would need to contain to be read as consistent with a high-speed accident. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. The plan she developed was thorough. 2 days before she left, she drove to a trailhead a quarter mile from the guardrail section on a Monday morning before dawn, left her second car there under the pretext of lending it to a colleague, and got a ride back to the city from a coworker. She had told a minor and plausible story about car trouble. The story required no follow-up. The colleague forgot about it by the following day. The second car sat at the trailhead for 48 hours. The night before she left, she made dinner. She sat across the table from Solomon and listened to him talk about a contract negotiation he was working on and asked the questions that the conversation required and gave the responses that were appropriate and felt the full weight of what she was about to leave. She did not try to make that weight smaller. She let it be what it was. She looked at him across the table and she held the full complicated reality of what she had loved and what it had cost her and what she was about to do, and she held all of it simultaneously without flinching, because she had spent 40 years becoming a woman who could hold difficult things simultaneously without flinching, and this was not going to be the moment she stopped. She washed the dishes after dinner. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark next to him and ran through the plan one final time, every step, every contingency. She found it sound. At 5:45 in the morning she got up. She dressed quietly in the dark. She went downstairs. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the room. The counter, the table, the window that faced the backyard garden she had planted in the second spring of the marriage. She looked at all of it, and then she picked up her keys and she walked out, and she did not look back once. She drove to the mountain road in the early dark. She did what she had planned at the guardrail section. She walked 300 yards to the trailhead and got in the second car and drove north. She stopped at a payphone 40 miles away and called Clara and said she was safe. Clara gave her an address. She drove 400 miles through a Tennessee morning that went from dark to gray to gold as the sun climbed, and arrived in Crestwood at 8:15 with $6,000, a lockbox, a bag of clothes, and 2 children she was carrying who did not yet know who they were, but who were going to find out. She picked up her keys and she walked out, and she did not look back once. She drove to the mountain road in the early dark. She did what she had planned at the guardrail section. She walked 300 yards to the trailhead and got in the second car and drove north. She stopped at a payphone 40 miles away and called Clara and said she was safe. Clara gave her an address. She drove 400 miles through a Tennessee morning that went from dark to gray to gold as the sun climbed, and arrived in Crestwood at 8:15 with $6,000, a lockbox, a bag of clothes, and 2 children she was carrying who did not yet know who they were, but who were going to find out. Crestwood, Tennessee had a population of 804 people, a traffic light permanently stuck on yellow that the entire town had decided, without any official vote or posted sign, to treat as a stop sign, a post office the size of a walk-in closet, a diner called Millie's that served breakfast and lunch and closed at 2 in the afternoon, a Baptist church on Harper Street, and a Pentecostal church 2 blocks over, a community library staffed by a woman named Miss V who had been the librarian for 19 years and who ran the place with the quiet, certain authority of someone who understands that libraries are not about books but about access, and that access is the point of everything. There was an elementary school at the east end of town that served Crestwood and 4 surrounding communities, that had fewer than 200 students, that operated on a budget that should not have made good education possible, and that made good education possible anyway, because of the specific dedication of the people inside it. Renata arrived at Burl and Marvel's house on a Thursday morning, and Marvel opened the door before she could knock, and said, "Come in, honey, breakfast is ready." Burl was 67, a retired electrician with large, steady hands, and the specific grace of a man who has spent his whole life fixing things, and who fixes them without ceremony or commentary, because he understands that the fixing is the point and the ceremony is not. Marvel was 65, a former teacher with a gift for warmth that asked nothing of the recipient, the kind of warmth that simply exists in a room and warms the room the way a radiator warms a room, without requiring acknowledgement or response. They had been hosting women through Clara's organization for 11 years. They had learned, across those years, that what women in Renata's situation needed in the first weeks was not advice, not processing, not a structured program. They needed food, warmth, and the specific freedom of a space that asked nothing of them while they found their footing. Burl and Marvel provided this without being told to. Clara found the rental house in the first week. It was at the end of a dirt road on the southern edge of town, a small white house that weather had faded to a warm near gray. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen that faced east and caught the morning light through a window above the sink. A back porch that looked out at an open field wherein the first winter deer came to the edge of the tree line at dusk, and stood in the fading light with the patient, unhurried quality of things that have lived here longer than anyone currently living here. A furnace that heated the house reliably but required a specific sequence of steps to start and would not respond to being rushed, which Renata came to find not frustrating but oddly companionable, as if the house had its own pace and was simply asking her to match it. $450 a month. Clara's organization covered the first 3 months. Renata moved in on a Saturday. She put her lockbox in the bedroom closet, hung her clothes in the small wardrobe, set 2 photographs on the windowsill in the kitchen, one of her parents and one of Gloria, both taken before the marriage, both people she had disappeared from and missed with a specific, physical pain she was going to have to learn to carry without being visible about it. She stood in the empty living room and felt what the house was. Cold. Quiet. Hers. Then she went to the kitchen and made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the light in the east-facing window and let herself be still for a few minutes before she began the work of building something new. She found work at Crestwood Elementary in the first month. Classroom aide at $11 an hour, which was the position available to someone with her situation, no local credential history, no verifiable employment record under her current name. On her first day, Miss Darlene, who had been principal of the school for 19 years and who had developed across those years a precise, reliable ability to recognize quality within approximately 20 minutes of encountering it, watched Renata work with a group of struggling readers for 45 minutes. She watched the specific quality of Renata's attention, the way she listened to each child individually, the way she calibrated her language to each child's level without condescension, the way she found the precise point where a child's understanding broke down and addressed that point directly rather than repeating the same instruction in a louder voice. At the end of the school day, she called Renata into her office and said, "I do not know your situation and I am not going to ask about it. What I know is that you are the best person I have put in a classroom in 10 years. I want you to have a classroom of your own. Tell me what you need to make that happen and I will help you make it happen." Renata said, "I need 18 months and someone who will work with me through the credentialing." Miss Darlene said, "You have both." And that was the beginning. Caleb and Jordan were born in August at the county hospital in Harlan, 40 miles north of Crestwood. Dr. Abernathy delivered them. She had worked with Clara's organization for 6 years, and her professional discretion was as absolute as her clinical skill. Caleb arrived first at 9:47 in the morning with an immediacy and a certainty that the delivery nurse described afterward as knowing exactly what it wanted. Jordan arrived 4 minutes later in a different register entirely, quieter, more considered, with an expression that suggested he had arrived already thinking about something. Renata held both of them against her chest in the recovery room and looked at their faces for a long time without speaking. She was looking for Solomon and finding him, in Caleb's brow, in Jordan's hands, in the specific quality of focus in both of their faces that she recognized as his, and that she felt. Looking at it here in this quiet hospital room, far from everything he had built, something more complicated than she had anticipated. Not regret, not grief exactly. The specific, bittersweet weight of loving something that was also the thing you had to survive. She held her sons and breathed. Then she said their names out loud. Caleb, Jordan. She had chosen them from people who had mattered. Caleb was her maternal grandfather, a man who had built houses in Ghana with his hands and had been gone since she was 18. Jordan was a name her father had mentioned once at dinner, years before the marriage, as a name he had always loved for a child. She had stored it without knowing she was storing it, and retrieved it now for the second child who had arrived with his father's watchful quality of attention. She did not give them Solomon's last name. She gave them hers. Caleb Osei and Jordan Osei. Their mother was Renata Osei. They were complete. The first year was the hardest thing Renata had ever done, and this requires weight to understand because the things Renata had already done were not easy. She had put herself through college on scholarship and 2 jobs. She had built a multi-county healthcare network on a budget that should not have made it possible. She had planned and executed an escape from a monitored marriage while carrying twin boys. She had driven 400 miles alone and started from nothing in a town where she knew no one. The first year with 2 infants in a cold house on $11 an hour in rural Tennessee was harder than all of those things combined. She was tired in the way that removes the boundary between tired and awake, That makes 5 in the morning and 11 at night feel indistinguishable in their quality of demanding. She was lonely in the specific way of a person who has been surrounded by people who knew her deeply for her entire adult life, and is now alone with 2 people who cannot yet hold a conversation. She missed her parents with a pain that arrived without warning. While she was cooking, while she was driving, while she was lying awake listening to the boys breathe in the next room. A physical sensation she had no name for other than the specific shape of the specific people she was missing. She got through it the same way she got through everything. One day at a time, one task at a time, executing the next right action with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned that the difference between surviving and not surviving is not heroism or dramatic will, but simply the willingness to do the next thing when the last thing is done. She went to work. She came home. She fed the boys. She put them to bed. She studied for her certification after they were asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with her textbooks and a cup of tea, in the house quiet around her, and the field dark behind the back porch and the furnace persuaded to warmth. She went to sleep. She got up. She did it again. The women at the school helped in the ways that working women help each other, covering, adjusting, providing the informal, practical mutual support that is one of the most important and most invisible systems in the working world. Cheryl, who worked at the front desk, made sure the easier assignments came to Renata on the days the boys were sick. A woman named Dottie who worked in the lunch program appeared at the classroom twice a week with food she described as leftovers, which was true in the technical sense. Burl came when things broke and fixed them without being asked and refused payment every time. Marvel appeared on the evenings that were specifically bad with food and warmth and the specific grace of knowing when to leave. She received her full teaching certification in the second year and took over a third-grade classroom the following September. 20 students. By the end of the first month, every parent in her class had heard from their child that Miss Osei's classroom was different from other classrooms in a way the children could feel, but not yet fully articulate. The children in her room were doing real work and they knew it and they valued it, which is the specific, uncommon achievement of a teacher who has understood that children do not need to be managed into engagement. They need to be given something genuine to engage with and trusted to meet it. By the end of the year, Miss Darlene had parents requesting Renata's classroom for the following year, which was technically not something that was supposed to happen at the elementary school level, and which Miss Darlene decided to allow because she had been running a school for 20 years and she knew what she was looking at, and she was not going to put a policy above a fact. The town built itself around Renata in the way that small communities build themselves around people who show up and do real work without making a ceremony of it. She volunteered at the Crestwood Clinic on the second Thursday of every month. She attended community meetings and spoke plainly about what the school needed. She kept the garden and shared the tomatoes when the season was good. She stopped at the broken traffic light every morning without exception, the same as everyone else, because that was what you did in Crestwood, because the community had decided together that stopping was correct and Renata had arrived in Crestwood intending to be a member of it, not a visitor to it, and members stopped at the light. She went to Millie's diner on Saturday mornings from the first month, and Millie made her coffee before she sat down, and asked no questions, and made very good biscuits, and Renata was grateful for all 3 of these things in the deep, cellular way that people are grateful for ordinary kindnesses when they have recently survived something that makes ordinary kindness feel like a specific form of grace. Caleb grew up loud and immediate and forward in the best sense of all 3 words. He moved through the world at full speed, completely engaged, treating every situation as something interesting to be understood and every problem as something to be solved directly and without delay. He decided at 5 that he wanted to be an architect and had designed 17 buildings on paper by his 6th birthday, none of which were structurally feasible and all of which were interesting in the way that things designed by people who care deeply about a subject and do not yet know all its rules are interesting. He took things apart to understand how they worked, was not always able to reassemble them in their original configuration, and considered this a reasonable trade for the understanding he had gained. He played soccer with a focused, physical joy that his coaches called enthusiasm, and that Renata recognized as a form of love. He arrived home from school every day with news that required immediate reporting and had, from the age of 4, a social network in Crestwood that included most of his class and a significant number of their parents. Jordan grew up quiet and interior and watchful in ways that made the adults around him feel both seen and slightly accountable. He remembered everything, not just facts but the quality of moments, the emotional register of a room, what a person had done with their hands while they were speaking. He had the rarest and most useful kind of intelligence, the kind that makes other people feel understood rather than evaluated. He had decided by age 6 that he wanted to be a doctor. He had arrived at this decision one afternoon at the Crestwood clinic, watching the volunteer physician examine 3 patients in sequence with the same focused, present, unhurried attention regardless of the time pressure in the waiting room. Jordan had observed this for an hour from the corner of the waiting room where Renata had left him with a book. On the drive home he said, "That is what I want to do." Renata glanced at him. She said, "It is the hardest thing there is to learn." He said, "I know. I want to learn it." She looked at the road. She believed him. What the boys knew about their father was exactly what Renata had decided was right for each stage of their lives. Calibrated with the same precision she applied to everything she communicated to children. When they were very small, they knew their father was not with them, and that this was complicated. When they were 5, she told them that he did not know they existed, and that this was not because he would not have wanted them, but because the situation had required it. At 5.5, Jordan had asked, "Is he a bad person?" Renata had thought carefully. She said, "He is a person who did things that hurt me without understanding that they were hurting me. That is different from bad. It is still something that had to be addressed." Jordan said, "Is it addressed?" Renata said, "It is being addressed." Jordan filed this in the interior place where he filed everything important and returned to his book. Caleb said, from across the room, "Does he know how to play basketball?" Renata said, "I think he tries." Caleb said, "Trying is not the same as knowing." Nobody could argue with this. Nobody tried. Renata kept a journal through all of these years. She wrote at the kitchen table after the boys were in bed, in the specific quiet of a house where everything that needed to happen that day had been done. She wrote about the work and the boys and what she was learning about herself in a life that was entirely and only hers. In the 4th year she wrote, "The most frightening thing to understand is not what he did. The most frightening thing is that I had been inside it long enough that I could not trust my own mind about it. I thought I might be imagining it. I thought I might be the problem. That is what these things do. They do not break you. They make you doubt the instrument you would use to know if you were broken." She read it back the same night and recognized it as the truest thing she had yet written. She left it on the page. She wrote about Solomon occasionally, not with bitterness, with the honest, clinical precision she brought to every assessment that mattered. She wrote about missing the version of him that existed at the beginning, before she understood what the beginning was the beginning of. She wrote about the specific complexity of grieving someone who was alive and who had done real harm, and who had also been genuinely, completely loved. She had no clean language for this. She wrote around it from different angles and did not arrive at a resolution because there was not a resolution to arrive at. There was only the truth of it, held in the journal, held alongside the tomatoes and the garden and the classroom and the boys breathing in the next room. Part of the complete and complicated and genuinely alive life she had built in the space she had made for herself. She missed her parents in a way that was one of the most significant costs of the decision she had made. She had sent 2 letters in the first 2 years, and signed, postmarked from cities she passed through, containing enough specific coded reference that her mother, who had known her for 36 years and knew her the way only the woman who carried you and raised you can know you, would understand that her daughter was alive and was choosing this silence for reasons that were real and not permanent. Her mother had written back to the post office box she included. The letter said, "I understand. I am here. I am not going anywhere. Come home when you can." Renata read this letter for the first time sitting at the kitchen table after the boys were asleep, and she cried for a long time in the specific way of a woman who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been given, for the first time, a surface to set part of it down on. The community of Crestwood was not remarkable by any standard measure. It was a small town with limited resources and a limited tax base and a school that should not have been as good as it was and a library that should not have been as well used as it was and a diner that should probably have closed years ago given the economics of small rural food service, but that had not closed because Millie had decided it was not going to close and Millie had been there since 6 in the morning making biscuits since 1987 and Millie's decision on the matter carried. What was remarkable about Crestwood was a quality that no external measurement captured: the specific, practiced willingness of the people inside it to hold each other without making a production of the holding. This was not a formal community value, not something that appeared in any mission statement or town charter. It was simply what the people of Crestwood did, because they had been doing it for long enough that it had become the condition of living there rather than an achievement of it. Renata had encountered this quality in the first week, when Marvel appeared at the rental house on the third evening with a pot of something that smelled like warmth and set it on the kitchen counter and said, "For tonight and tomorrow," and left without being asked anything. She had encountered it from Burl, who appeared whenever something broke and fixed it without ceremony and declined payment with the specific, quiet dignity of a man who understood that some debts could not and should not be discharged financially. She had encountered it from Miss Darlene, who had recognized quality in 20 minutes and had organized her administrative capacity around enabling it for 18 months. She had encountered it from Cheryl and Dottie and Marlene and Miss V and Dr. Abernathy and Millie, and from the parents of her students who had, over years, come to know her not as a figure in the institutional landscape of their children's education, but as a member of their community whose quality of presence they valued and whose continued presence they were invested in. When the story broke and the cameras arrived, Crestwood responded with the collective, unhurried, completely unapologetic protectiveness of a community that has decided who belongs to it. They declined to be sources. They declined to be background. They declined to be the picturesque small-town setting that national media wanted to use as the frame for a story that was not theirs to tell. They went about their days, opened the diner, staffed the library, ran the school, kept the clinic running, stopped at the broken traffic light, and presented to the cameras and the reporters and the satellite trucks the specific, impenetrable surface of people who have nothing to say to people who have not earned the right to ask. The story the outside world got was a headline. The story Crestwood kept was the real one, the one built across 8 years of Tuesday mornings and Wednesday suppers and October gardens, and the broken traffic light nobody had fixed and nobody particularly needed to fix, because everyone had already decided what to do about it. Solomon Grant's grief was genuine. This is worth saying clearly before anything else about his 7 years, because the easiest version of this story would be to make his grief false, to make the mourning performative, to make the hospital wing and the scholarship and the annual cemetery visits into a theater of innocence. They were not. He loved Renata, and the loss of her left a damage in him that was structural rather than surface, and that did not diminish in the way that surface damage diminishes. He sold the original company 8 months after the funeral because he could not walk through those offices without seeing her work on every wall and in every system and functioning inside the reminder of what was gone and what would not come back. He started Meridian Health Solutions from scratch in the second year because building was the only form of forward motion that kept him from stopping entirely, and stopping was not something he was going to do, because stopping was not the kind of thing his father had raised him to do. He built. He worked. He kept going. He went to therapy in the second year. His therapist, Dr. Whitman, had been in practice for 25 years and had the specific gift of not being interested in making her clients feel better faster than they were capable of feeling better genuinely. In the third session, she said to him, "I want to ask you something different today. Tell me what the marriage was like for her." Solomon started to answer in the terms he had always used, that it was a partnership, that they were equals, that he had supported and respected her work. Dr. Whitman let him finish. Then she said, "When she told you what she needed, what happened?" Solomon said, "I listened." She said, "And then?" He said, "I considered it." She said, "And then?" He was quiet. Then he said, "I decided what was appropriate." She said, "You decided what was appropriate for her." He said, "For us." She said, "Did she agree with your decisions?" He thought about this. He said, "She raised concerns sometimes." She said, "What happened to the concerns?" He said, "I explained why the decision I had made was the correct one." She said, "Every time?" He said, "Most times." She said, "Did she ever raise the same concern more than once?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Yes." She said, "What happened the second time?" He said, "I explained it again." Dr. Whitman said nothing. The silence in the room had a specific quality. He said, "I see what you were showing me." She said, "Tell me what you see." He said, "I made myself the authority on her life without her consent." She said, "Yes." He said, because I was certain I was right. She said, yes. He said, and the certainty protected me from understanding what I was doing to her. She said, yes. That was session 3. He came back the following week and the week after, and for 2 years after that. And the work he did in those sessions, and in the years that followed, was not comfortable, and was not fast, and was not done for an audience. It was done because he was a man who believed that understanding what you had done was an obligation that did not expire when the person you had done it to was no longer present to require it of you. He read everything available on coercive control in intimate relationships. He found himself described in the research with an accuracy that left no comfortable distance. He did not find in that research the image of a monster. He found something more difficult, the image of a man who had done real harm through the sincere, unexamined belief that his love entitled him to manage the person he loved, that knowing everything about her and controlling the conditions of her life was the same activity as protecting her and caring for her. He had confused these things for years. He had not known he was confusing them. The research was specific about this. This was not an unusual confusion. It was the most common context for intimate partner harm, the mechanism most consistently present when harm escalated to violence. The sincerity of the belief did not reduce the harm. The love did not cancel what it cost her. He sat with this for a long time. He kept sitting with it. He did not perform the reckoning for anyone. It was private work, and he did it privately in the specific, unglamorous way that the most necessary work is done. In the 6th year, he called Gloria. He found her number through an old networking event entry in the company archive. He said, I need to talk to you about the phone call I made to you during my marriage to Renata. Gloria said, you have some nerve. He said, yes, I do. She said, 30 minutes. He took 2 hours, and she gave them. At the end of those 2 hours, he had a clearer and more painful understanding of what the phone call had meant to Renata. Not just the content, but the quality of violation it represented, the specific way it had made her invisible inside her own life, than anything he had arrived at through reading or therapy. He thanked Gloria. She said, if she is out there somewhere, which I have believed from the beginning, I hope she knows you are doing this work. He said, I hope so too. He drove home and sat in the apartment with her portrait on the wall and thought about the notebook he had found in the 2nd year. The one with the financial calculations that he had put in the back of his desk drawer and left there, and he understood, for the first time, precisely what it had been. He rebuilt the philanthropic division of the company in the 5th year with the genuine operational independence that Renata had spent 5 years of their marriage trying to build inside a structure that consistently undermined it. He funded the community health access work. He told the new director on her first day, your job is to do this work correctly. My job is to support you and stay out of your way. The statement surprised her. He meant it entirely. He did not know, on the day he said it, whether he was capable of fully executing it. He worked on it. He never stopped driving to the cemetery on the anniversary. He never moved her things from the reading room. He kept the photograph in his desk, the one from the farmer's market, her laughing at the pineapple, completely unaware she was being captured. He had carried it for 10 years by the time Grace walked into his office on a Tuesday in October with a folder and 2 photographs, and a look he had never seen on her professional face before. There was a drive Solomon made in the 4th year of Renata's absence that he had never mentioned to anyone. Not to Darius. Not to Dr. Whitman. He had driven south on a Thursday in November, following nothing more specific than the feeling, which he would have dismissed as irrational in any professional context, and which he acted on because grief, by the 4th year, had stripped away many of the filters he normally applied to the gap between what he felt and what he did. He drove south and then east and onto state highways and then county roads, and he stopped for lunch at a diner in a town called Harlan and sat at the counter and drank bad coffee and talked briefly to the woman who poured it, who had the comprehensive local knowledge of someone who has worked in the same place for a long time. He asked if she knew a town called Crestwood. She said, sure. 40 minutes north. Nice little place. He drove 40 minutes north. He drove through Crestwood on a Thursday afternoon in November of the 4th year, through the main street, past the diner, the post office, the elementary school, the broken traffic light. He parked outside Millie's and got out and stood on the sidewalk in the November cold for a moment, not knowing what he was doing, knowing only that he was not going to find her by instinct and a Thursday drive. He went into the diner. He sat at the counter. He ordered coffee. Millie brought it and looked at him with the direct, Comprehensive assessment of a woman who has seen every kind of person sit at this counter for 3 decades, and who does not miss much. She said, "You look like a man who drove a long way for the wrong reason." He said, "I might be." She said, "You looking for someone?" He said, "I think so." She said, "People who come here looking for someone usually don't find them. The people here came here not to be found." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "That is good advice." He drank the coffee. He paid. He drove back to Atlanta. He never went back. He never told anyone. He had understood, sitting at Millie's counter, that he had no right to look, that if she was somewhere and had chosen to be invisible, her choice was the only thing that mattered and his need to know was irrelevant to it. He went home. He went to work. He kept the feeling in the back of his mind alongside the notebook with the financial calculations, both of them too important to discard and too uncertain to act on. 3 years later, Grace put 2 photographs on his desk, and he understood, all at once and completely, that the feeling and the notebook had both been telling him the same thing, and he had been right to wait for the moment when he could act on it correctly rather than acting on it from need.
The Tuesday it happened was ordinary in every observable way. Solomon was in his office at 11 reviewing third-quarter projections. The city outside his window was doing its Tuesday morning things. He had already approved 2 contracts, rejected 1, sent a memo to his operations director. He was working efficiently, the way he always worked. Then Grace knocked once and came in with a folder and the look that had no name. Meridian provided healthcare technology services to a network of rural hospitals. Part of the service included administrative platform migration, processing paper record backlogs when hospitals joined the Meridian system. One of those hospitals was in Harlan County, Tennessee. Their volunteer coordination records were being migrated that week. In that backlog was a volunteer intake form submitted 18 months earlier. The woman had listed her name as Renata Was. The date of birth was his wife's date of birth exactly. The emergency contact was listed as Gloria, with a last name Grace had found in the company archive from a networking event, the last name of Renata's closest friend, the woman Solomon had spoken to at the graveside, the woman he had called during the marriage. Grace had pulled the photograph from the volunteer form and placed it beside the portrait on his desk. She had walked into his office and said his name. He looked at the photographs. He put the folder down. He picked it up. He held it with both hands with the careful, deliberate steadiness of a man managing the behavior of his own body. He said, "Is there an address?" She said, "Yes." She placed a piece of paper on his desk. He read it. He sat still for 60 seconds and counted them. Then he picked up his keys and walked out. He drove south for 4 hours. He did not call anyone, not Darius, not Francis his attorney, not anyone. He drove with both hands on the wheel and the full weight of every possible version of the truth pressing on him simultaneously, and he held all of it, and kept driving through the gray Atlanta morning, and onto the interstate and south, and then east, and on state highways that narrowed as they moved into Tennessee, and then onto county roads that narrowed further as they climbed into hill country that was going gold and red with the October light. He stopped once for gas and stood at the pump in his work clothes in a county where nobody knew his name and experienced the specific suspended quality of a person whose identity has been built entirely around other people's recognition of them standing in a place where he is simply a man at a pump in October. He got back in the car. Crestwood appeared with a water tower visible above the tree line and a traffic light blinking yellow at an empty intersection. He drove through the main street at low speed. The diner, the post office, the elementary school, its playground empty in the late morning. He turned south on the road the address indicated and drove past small houses with gardens and the particular quietness of a weekday residential neighborhood in a town where most of the adults are at work. The road became a lane. The lane became dirt. He drove to the end of it and stopped and turned off the engine. The house was white, weathered to a warm near gray by years of Tennessee weather. A garden along the side of the house, the last of the autumn tomatoes still on the vine, heavy and red in the October light. A basketball hoop in the side yard, a metal post set in concrete with a wooden backboard and a rim, clearly homemade, slightly tilted. 2 pairs of small shoes on the front step, side by side, identical in design, different in size by a margin almost too small to see except for the fact of standing directly beside each other. He looked at those shoes for a long time. He gripped the steering wheel. He thought about nothing specific. He simply sat in the Tennessee October and breathed. Then the front door opened, and a boy came out. He was 6 years old. He came down the front steps with the complete, forward, unstudied physical confidence of a child who has never been uncertain about whether his body belongs in any space it occupies. He went to the basketball hoop, picked up a ball from the grass, and threw it at the basket without calculating the shot. The ball missed. He picked it up, missed again. On the third attempt, the ball went through the rim, and the boy celebrated with both arms in the specific, brief, complete way of a child celebrating for himself rather than for an audience. Solomon watched and did not breathe. The boy had his posture, his specific, natural, completely unself-conscious way of occupying physical space. Then the door opened a second time, and a second boy appeared in the frame. He did not come down the steps. He leaned against the door frame and looked at his brother, and then at the car at the end of the lane with the watchful, interior, building attention of someone who processes everything before responding to anything. Their eyes met through the windshield. The second boy straightened up and went inside without hurrying. 30 seconds later, Renata came to the door.
She had seen the car from the kitchen window while she was washing the lunch dishes from the boys' midday meal. She had been watching it for 45 seconds before it registered what it was, and then it registered completely and all at once. She said to Jordan, who was at the kitchen table with a book, "Go get your brother and stay in the kitchen until I come for you." Jordan said, very quietly, without drama, "Is that him?" She said, "Yes." He got up and went to the back door and called Caleb in from the yard and closed the door. She went to the front. Solomon was at the end of the lane. He was standing with his hands at his sides. He was not approaching. He looked like a man who has decided that approaching without permission would be the wrong thing, and who is enforcing that decision on himself through the stillness of his whole body. He was thinner than she remembered, not gaunt, but the thinning of a person who has been spending their resources on something other than taking care of themselves for a sustained period. He looked like someone who was still in it, not moved past, not rebuilt around the absence, still in it. She had spent 7 years knowing this was possible and thinking she had prepared herself for the sight of it, and finding, standing in her doorway in the October afternoon, that she had not prepared herself adequately at all. She said, "Come up on the porch." He came up the steps and sat on the top step. She leaned against the post. 3 feet of porch between them and 7 years of everything else. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I have been all right for a long time." He said, "The boys?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Both mine?" She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him hold the arithmetic of it, 6 years old, which meant she had been pregnant when she left, which meant she had known and had gone anyway, which meant she had carried 2 people through their entire lives without telling him, watched all of it arrive in his face, and watched him hold it without collapsing. He said, "What are their names?" She told him. He said each name once, quietly, as if learning the weight of them. He said, "Are they healthy?" She said, "Very." He said, "What are they like?" She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Caleb will tell you himself. Jordan will take longer, but when he tells you it will be more than you were expecting." He almost smiled, and it was the first thing she recognized from before, that specific almost smile that meant he had heard something accurate. She said, "You can eat with us tonight." He said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me yet." She made dinner, the Wednesday meal, rice and beans and fried plantains, because it was the meal that the day called for, and she was not going to reorganize her household around the arrival of Solomon Grant. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway within 2 minutes of Solomon sitting at the table, drawn by the presence of something interesting the way he was always drawn by the presence of something interesting. He assessed Solomon with the complete, direct, unfiltered evaluative attention of a 6-year-old who takes nothing on faith. He said, "Are you our dad?" Solomon said, "Yes." Caleb said, "Why didn't you come before?" Solomon said, "I did not know where you were." Caleb thought about this. He said, "Do you know how to play basketball?" Solomon said, "I do." Caleb said, "Your form is probably wrong." Solomon said, "You might be right." Caleb appeared satisfied with this exchange and returned to the table with the manner of someone who has completed a necessary assessment and arrived at a provisional conclusion. Jordan ate his food quietly across the table and said nothing for the first 20 minutes. He was watching Solomon with the interior, patient, building quality of someone who assembles complete pictures before committing to any response. At the 20-minute mark, he said, "Mom says you did things that were not safe for us to know you." Solomon went completely still. Jordan said, "Did you know you were doing them?" Solomon said, "No. I understood later." Jordan said, "How much later?" Solomon said, "Too late to change what happened." Jordan considered this. He said, "Are you going to keep understanding it, or are you going to stop?" Solomon said, "I am going to keep." Jordan said, "Good." He went back to his food. Renata was at the counter with her back to the table, and she pressed both hands flat against the surface and held herself still. After dinner, Renata put the boys to bed. She went through the full architecture of it, the teeth, the water, the negotiation between Caleb and Jordan about whose turn it was to choose the story, the specific patient work of arriving at a mutually acceptable outcome between two people with strong opinions about their own preferences. Solomon sat at the kitchen table and waited. He did not move from the table. He did not look through anything. He sat with his hands flat on the table in the posture of a man who has been told to wait and has decided with his whole body to do exactly that for as long as it takes. It took 45 minutes. Then Renata came back and sat across from him, and he said, "Tell me." She said, "All of it." He said, "All of it." She said, "You will listen without speaking until I am finished." He said, "Yes." She talked for 2 hours and 50 minutes. She did not hurry and did not soften and did not edit for his comfort. She had been composing this account in her mind for 7 years with the knowledge that the day might arrive when she would need to give it aloud, and she gave it the way she gave every important professional assessment, completely, sequentially, with every relevant detail in its correct position. She told him about the program oversight, and when she had first understood that it was something other than interest. She told him about the financial monitoring and the full scope of what she had found when she looked at it carefully. She told him about the 3 years of watching certain friendships quietly and incrementally fade, not through any single event, but through the accumulated effect of small, concerned, patient, sincere comments delivered at moments when her guard was down, until the social landscape around her had been reduced to the dimensions easiest for him to manage. She told him about the phone call to Gloria. She told him about the 3 months of mapping everything on a legal pad after dinner, after he was at his desk, watching the full shape emerge from the pieces she had been taking at face value for years. She told him about the lockbox behind the winter coats, the 9 months of accumulating cash, the notary 40 miles away, the certified documents, the second car at the trailhead, the mountain road, the drive north in the early March dark. She told him about Clara and Burl and Marvel and Miss Darlene and Dr. Abernathy and the boys born in August and the 7 years since. All of it, start to finish. Nothing held back. When she finished, she put both hands flat on the table and looked at him directly and waited. He was quiet for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. The field behind the house was dark. He sat with everything she had given him, and he did not rush toward the things he felt, and did not manage the room, and did not fill the silence with anything that was not true. Then he said, "I know why you left." She said, "Say the specific reasons." He said, "Because I called your closest friend without your knowledge and treated your social life as something that required my oversight. Because I monitored your communications without telling you and without your consent. Because I controlled your access to money and called it household management. Because I made myself the final authority over your professional work and over every part of our shared life, and I never once asked whether that authority was mine to hold." He said it without hesitation and without defense, in a single breath, the way a person says something they have been holding for a long time and have finally found the moment to put down. She looked at him. He said, "I spent 4 years in therapy understanding this. I am not telling you I know it because I expected to change what it cost you. I am telling you I know it so that you understand I am not asking you to forgive something I have not seen clearly." She said, "I hear that." He said, "Is that enough for tonight?" She said, "It is enough for tonight." He said, "Then I will take tonight, and I will come back tomorrow, and keep coming back until you tell me to stop." She said, "That is all I am offering right now." He said, "It is more than I have any right to ask for." They were quiet for a while. Then she showed him the couch. He did not sleep. He did not try to sleep. He lay on the couch in the dark of Renata's living room and listened to the house. The furnace persuading itself to warmth. The specific boards. The breathing of 2 children through a thin wall 12 feet away. He had been a father for 6 years and had not known it. And the weight of that fact arrived in the dark not as a wound, but as something more complex. As the full, three-dimensional reality of 6 years of specific mornings and specific meals and soccer games, and building designs and bedtime negotiations that had happened without him and had produced two complete, specific, extraordinary people who were breathing through that wall. He let the weight of it be what it was. He did not try to make it smaller or more manageable. He just held it in the dark until the sky outside began to lighten. Caleb came downstairs at 6 and found Solomon sitting up on the couch. He stopped in the doorway and looked at him with the full inventory expression. He said, "You stayed." Solomon said, "Your mother let me use the couch." Caleb said, "She does not usually do that." Solomon said, "I know. I am grateful she made an exception." Caleb said, "I am going to fix your basketball form after breakfast." Solomon said, "I will look forward to it." Caleb said, "It is not optional." He went to the kitchen with the purposeful air of a person who has completed an initial assessment and has a full schedule. Solomon looked at the ceiling for a moment and felt something shift inside him that was small and real, and that was the beginning of something he did not yet have a name for. Jordan appeared 15 minutes later carrying a book. He walked to the far end of the couch and sat down. He held the book in his lap and looked at Solomon. Solomon recognized it, a novel he had given Renata early in their relationship, a book he had loved and given to her because he wanted to share it, and that she had read and told him, accurately, and with the specific pleasurable directness that had been one of the first things he loved about her, that the protagonist's problem was not that the two things he loved were incompatible, but that he kept trying to make one of them smaller so they would fit instead of accepting that both of them needed full-sized space. Jordan was holding this book the way you hold something you have been keeping. Solomon said, "I know that book." Jordan said, "Your name is written inside the front cover." Solomon said, "It was my book. I gave it to your mother a long time ago." Jordan looked at the book for a moment. He said, "My full name is Jordan Emmanuel Osei. Emmanuel was my great-grandfather's name. My mother named me after him." Solomon looked at his son. He said, "That is a very good name." Jordan said, "I know." He sat quietly with the book in his lap. Solomon was quiet. The morning light came through the window, pale gold, Tennessee October. They sat together in it, and neither of them needed to add anything to it. Renata came downstairs at 6:15 and stopped in the living room doorway. Solomon on one end of the couch, Jordan on the other end with the book. The morning between them. She stood there for a moment. From the kitchen came Caleb's voice announcing that he was technically a guest this morning because of the special occasion, and that guests did not pour their own orange juice. Renata said, without taking her eyes off Solomon, "You are not a guest in your own kitchen, Caleb. She went to make breakfast." Solomon heard her tell Caleb to pour his own juice, and heard Caleb say this was deeply inhospitable, and heard Renata say that deeply inhospitable was a very impressive phrase for 6 in the morning, and heard Caleb say he had been saving it for the right moment. Something in Solomon's chest eased. He did not know exactly what it was. He knew it had been tight for a very long time and was, in this moment, slightly less so. He got up and followed his family to the kitchen. Solomon called Francis from the front porch the next morning. He went outside to make the call because making it from inside Renata's house, in her space, felt like a thing he should not do without her knowledge and her agreement. He sat on the top step where he had sat 2 nights before, and he called Francis, who had practiced family law in Atlanta for 22 years, and who had the specific, clear-eyed quality of someone who cares only about what is correct rather than who is right. He described the situation in 4 minutes. Francis listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Is she physically safe where she is?" He said, "Completely." She said, "Good. Here is what you are dealing with legally." He said, "Before you tell me, I need to tell you what I am not doing." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I am not pursuing any action against her. I am not using the legal situation to pressure her. I am not challenging her decision to leave the marriage or any of the steps she took afterward. Whatever the legal process requires, it has to be designed to protect her, not to pressure her." Francis was quiet for a moment. She said, "You understand that position gives up significant legal standing." He said, "I understand completely." She said, "Are you certain?" He said, "I have been certain about this for 4 years." She said, "For years." He said, "I have been in therapy for 4 years understanding what I did in my marriage. I am not going to use the legal system to compound it." Francis was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I am driving up tomorrow." He said, Thank you. Renata had Carolyn. She had retained Carolyn 3 years earlier through Clara's organization, a family safety attorney based in Knoxville who had practiced in this specific area for 18 years and who had a 2-inch file on Renata's situation and a framework document already prepared for exactly the day that had arrived. When Renata called her the morning after Solomon appeared, Carolyn said, "I am already packing." The two attorneys worked across Renata's kitchen table for 4 days and produced a framework document that covered every dimension of the legal situation with the methodical thoroughness of two experienced professionals who had agreed, without needing to discuss it, that the governing principle of everything they produced was the well-being of 2 6-year-old boys. The document addressed the death certificate reversal, the identity corrections across 5 years of records, the children's birth documents and the addition of their father's name, the estate adjustments required by Solomon's declared widowhood, the custody and co-parenting structure, and the trust for the boys using the life insurance funds that Solomon offered on the first morning, unprompted, saying plainly, "That money is the boys', not mine. I have known that since the moment I understood what happened. I want it in a trust that Renata administers and that I have no management role in." The document also included a statement Solomon wrote himself, in his own words and not through his attorney, acknowledging the specific patterns of behavior in his marriage that constituted coercive control and committing to the behavioral and therapeutic work required to ensure those patterns did not continue. He did not object to the characterization of his behavior as coercive control. He confirmed it, because it was accurate, and he was not going to perform ignorance of accurate things to protect himself from accountability. Carolyn read the statement. She set it down. She said, "In 18 years I have produced many of these documents. This one is different." Solomon said, "It is true." She said, "That is exactly the difference." They signed the framework. Solomon signed his across the table from Renata. He looked up when his pen left the paper. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. Some moments do not need words, and this was one of them. The story became public 6 weeks after Solomon drove to Crestwood. It became public through the specific, unhurried inevitability of institutional records. The death certificate reversal required a court filing. The estate corrections required financial disclosures. The children's documents required amendment. And all of these processes generated public records that were, by definition, accessible to anyone who knew where to look. A reporter at a regional business publication looked. The headline read, "Atlanta founder's wife, declared dead 7 years ago, found alive in Tennessee with twin sons." Within 48 hours it was everywhere. Solomon released a statement. He wrote it himself in 3 sentences. "My family is whole. We asked for privacy. Nothing else." He gave no interviews. He held no press conference. He did not use the situation to tell any story about himself. Not a story of loss or redemption or transformation or anything else. He said his family was whole, and he asked for privacy, and he closed his mouth. Renata said nothing for 3 months. When she spoke, she submitted 4 sentences through Carolyn. "I made the decisions my situation required, and I stand by them entirely. My sons are safe and well. I am grateful to the people of Crestwood, Tennessee, who held us when we needed holding. I have nothing further to say." People wanted more. Renata had anticipated this and was not moved by it. She had spent 7 years building a life on the reliable foundation of fact rather than narrative, and she was not going to begin performing for an audience simply because the audience had grown. In Crestwood, the story landed differently than it landed everywhere else. Crestwood had known Renata Was for 7 years. They had watched her teach their children, volunteer at the clinic, tend her garden, attend community meetings, and stop at the broken traffic light every morning without exception. They had their own version of her story, built from 7 years of specific ordinary contact, and they were not going to help the outside world extract a different version from it. Miss Darlene told the school board, "Miss Was is the finest teacher this school has had in 20 years, and she has my complete confidence and my complete support." She sat down. No one asked a further question. Millie turned reporters away from the diner door with the cheerful, implacable authority of a woman in her own establishment. Miss V declined to discuss any patron. Burl closed the door on a television crew without saying a word. The town that had held Renata for 7 years held her again in the same way, quietly, without ceremony, and without asking anything in return. The domestic safety and coercive control advocacy community followed the legal documents carefully and wrote about the case with the specific attention of professionals who spend their careers trying to make certain patterns visible and who find it significant when a public case makes those patterns undeniable. They noted that Solomon's behavior had been specifically and explicitly named as coercive control in the framework document, that he had confirmed this characterization without objection, and that he had not used the legal system to minimize his accountability despite having significant resources available to do so. They noted this clearly while being equally clear that Renata's survival was entirely her own achievement and the achievement of the people who had supported her, not the product of anything Solomon had done correctly. Solomon bought a house 20 minutes from Crestwood. Not in Crestwood. He understood without being told that arriving in Renata's town and making it his was not something he was going to do. He bought a place on 5 acres with a field behind it, and an old barn that needed work and a flat area in the side yard that he had paved into a basketball court over 2 weekends with Darius, who drove from Atlanta both times without being asked more than once, showed up with tools, and a level, and the specific, practical loyalty of a man who has been your friend since you were 19 and who understands that sometimes friendship looks exactly like this, showing up with a level and not asking too many questions. The court was level. Caleb inspected it on his first visit with the serious thoroughness of someone conducting a professional assessment, threw shots from 4 different angles, tested the surface integrity in 3 spots, and said, "It will do." This was, Solomon came to understand, high praise. He returned to weekly therapy. He told Dr. Whitman what had happened. She said, "How does it feel to be in the presence of the actual consequences of what you did?" He said, "Like the theory became 3-dimensional." She said, and he said, "The theory was harder to live with." She said, "Why?" He said, "In the theory she was gone. In the actual consequences she is alive, and she has built something extraordinary without me, and the boys are real, and they are remarkable, and there is something in knowing all of that that is painful, and also right." She waited. He said, "Right in the way that a thing that was wrong being corrected is right, even when the correction cost more than it should have." She said, "Yes." He said, "I know I cannot take credit for the correction." She said, "No?" He said, "I am glad it happened anyway." She said, "That is the right feeling. That is exactly the right feeling." He restructured Meridian's philanthropic division to do the work properly. The community health access work that Renata had spent 5 years of their marriage trying to build inside a structure that he had consistently and sincerely undermined. He funded it fully. He gave the director complete operational independence and told her on her first day, "Your job is to do this correctly. My job is to support you and not be in your way." The Harlan County Hospital, the one whose volunteer form had cracked everything open, received the first full Meridian Community Health Technology package at no cost. He did this because it was the right thing, and because right things do not require announcement to be worth doing. He found Clara through Carolyn and called her. He said, "Your organization helped my wife and my sons when they needed it more than anything. I want to make sure you can keep doing that for other people." He asked what she needed. She told him. He provided it without requesting acknowledgement or visibility. Clara told Renata 2 months later. Renata looked out the kitchen window for a moment. She said, "That is the man I thought I was marrying." Clara said, "Is he?" Renata said, "He is becoming him." He came every weekend. Every single weekend, without missing once, from the Saturday after the framework was signed. He came without agenda, and without performance, and without attempting to accelerate what was building between him and the boys into something faster than it wanted to naturally become. He learned Caleb by standing outside buildings in Knoxville on Saturday mornings, letting Caleb describe what was wrong with them, and asking the questions that Caleb's descriptions opened up. He learned Jordan by sitting in the Knoxville Public Library on alternate Saturday afternoons, both of them reading different things, saying very little, occupying the same space in the specific way that some relationships require the removal of agenda to develop. He did not manage these experiences. He let them be what they were. He trusted that something real was accumulating even when he could not see its full shape. Caleb fixed Solomon's basketball form the following Saturday. He did this with the focused, systematic thoroughness of an 8-year-old who has identified a problem and is committed to solving it completely rather than partially. He adjusted Solomon's elbow position, his wrist release, his follow-through, his balance point before the shot. He made Solomon practice each adjustment in isolation before combining them. He corrected with the patient, direct authority of a natural teacher who does not soften feedback, because softening it would make it less useful. At the end of the session, Solomon made 4 consecutive shots from the free throw line, and Caleb said, "Better." "Not good yet." "Better." Solomon said, "I will take better." Caleb said, "You should." It took work. He picked up the ball and went inside. Solomon stood at the free throw line for a moment in the Tennessee Saturday morning and felt, in the specific quality of the silence after a child has gone inside, something he had no name for. Something that was the presence of a person who had decided, provisionally, that he was worth instructing. He was not going to take this for granted. He was not going to take any of it for granted. Gloria came to Crestwood 6 weeks after the story broke. She drove from Atlanta on a Sunday and arrived in the afternoon and found Renata in the garden pulling the last of the season's tomatoes from the vines. Gloria stood at the edge of the garden for a moment, and Renata looked up, and they looked at each other across the dirt path in the 7 years. Gloria said, "You could have told me." Renata said, "I know." Gloria said, "I would have kept it." Renata said, "I know that too. I could not carry knowing you knew. It was safer for both of us." Gloria said, "That is a very practical answer." Renata said, "I am a very practical person." Gloria said, "You always were." She came through the gate and they held each other for a long time in the garden with the last tomatoes on the vines around them and the October light coming down through the tree line at the edge of the field, and neither of them said anything because they did not need to. Then Gloria pulled back and looked at Renata's face and said, "You look well." Renata said, "I am well." Gloria said, "I can see that." She stayed 4 days. She met Caleb, who assessed her in 3 minutes and declared her acceptable and immediately asked whether she knew any good architects. She met Jordan, who shook her hand with the seriousness of someone conducting a real transaction. She sat on the back porch 2 evenings with Renata after the boys were in bed, and they talked the way they had always talked, completely, without management, with the specific freedom of 2 women who have known each other for 20 years and have no useful fictions between them. They talked about Solomon, what Gloria had seen in him from the outside across the 7 years, what had changed and what had not, and what was still uncertain. Renata listened to all of it. Then she said, "What do you think?" Gloria said, "I think you are the only person who gets to answer that question, and I think you know the answer, and I think you are taking your time, because you have absolutely earned the right to." Renata said, "Yes." Gloria said, "Good." She refilled both their glasses. They stayed up too late talking about everything and nothing, which was the most specific pleasure of a very old friendship restored. The boy's 8th birthday was a Saturday in August. Renata made the food, jollof rice and fried plantains, and the particular cake her mother had taught her to make that Caleb had declared, at age 5, his favorite food in the world, and had not revised this assessment since. Solomon came. Darius came, driving from Atlanta in the morning, arriving with 2 presents that were identical in wrapping and different in content, because he had understood from a single conversation with Renata that Caleb and Jordan were too individual to be treated as a unit. Miss V came. Burl and Marvel came. Gloria came from Atlanta and brought her daughter, who was 6, and who Caleb immediately appointed as the target of a comprehensive architectural tour of the backyard, which the 6-year-old endured with the polite tolerance of a child who has been raised to be kind to people who are enthusiastic about things she does not share enthusiasm for. Jordan spent most of the party in the corner of the back porch with one of his birthday books, a medical reference text he had asked for specifically, which Renata had ordered from a specialty bookstore in Knoxville, reading with the total absorption of a person who has received exactly what they wanted and intends to use it immediately. At the end of the day, after most people had gone and Burl and Marvel were in the kitchen helping Renata with the dishes and Solomon was in the side yard with Darius watching the last of the daylight go, Caleb appeared beside Solomon and stood there for a moment. Solomon looked down at him. Caleb said, "This was a good birthday." Solomon said, "I think so too." Caleb said, "You should come to the next one." Solomon said, "I plan to." Caleb said, "Good." He went inside. Solomon stood in the side yard in the August evening and Darius said, very quietly and without looking at him, "You understand what just happened?" Solomon said, "Yes." Darius said, "Good. Don't waste it." There was a Sunday evening in the 2nd October after Solomon first drove down the dirt road that both of them have returned to many times in their private thinking, neither having said this to the other directly. It was ordinary in every observable way. The boys had been at Solomon's for the weekend, and he had brought them back Sunday afternoon, and Renata had made dinner, and Solomon had stayed because Caleb had asked him to, which was an invitation Solomon had learned to receive simply as what it was, his son wanting him to stay, rather than as something requiring interpretation. After dinner, Solomon washed the dishes. He had started doing this on the 4th or 5th Sunday without being asked and without announcing it, simply because there were dishes and he was there, and it was the next obvious thing to do. Renata picked up the dish towel and started drying. This was also not planned. She simply picked it up because it was there. They stood at the kitchen sink in the house at the end of the dirt road in Crestwood, Tennessee, and washed and dried the dinner dishes in the quiet of a Sunday evening, which is an activity that asks nothing of two people, and that reveals, for that specific reason, exactly what two people are when they are not asking anything of each other. What it revealed was this: they were easy. Easy in the specific sense of not managing anything or monitoring anything or performing anything. Not working at being comfortable, simply being it. Two people at a sink in October, the field dark outside the window, the furnace warm and persuaded, the boys upstairs beginning the negotiation that preceded sleep, which neither of them paid attention to because the negotiation always resolved, and they had both learned to trust that it would. Solomon washed a plate and handed it to her. She dried it and put it in the cabinet. He washed another. The kitchen smelled like dinner and dish soap and the specific October smell of the garden outside the window, the last of the season going into the ground. He said, "I have been thinking about the book Jordan keeps." She said, "Yes." He said, "When I gave it to you, I told you the protagonist's problem was loving two incompatible things." She said, "I told you that was wrong." He said, "You said his problem was that he kept making one of them smaller so they would fit, instead of accepting that both of them needed full-size space." She said, "Yes." He said, "I spent 5 years making you smaller so we would fit." She dried a bowl and set it in the cabinet. She did not respond immediately. He said, "I know you know that. I am saying it out loud so that you know I know it, and I know that knowing it is not the same as what it cost you, and I am not asking it to be." She said, "I hear that." He said, "Is that enough for tonight?" She said, "It is enough for tonight." He said, "Then I will take tonight." She said, "Good." They finished the dishes. He said good night and drove home. She stood in the kitchen after he left and listened to the house. The furnace. The boys upstairs, their voices going quieter. The field behind the window, dark and still. She was exactly where she was. She had built this place. She had earned the right to be here, at exactly this pace, deciding exactly what she was ready to decide, and not being rushed by anyone toward anything she had not yet verified. She turned off the kitchen light. She went upstairs. She checked on her sons. Miss Darlene retired in the spring of the 2nd year after Solomon arrived. Her retirement party filled the school gymnasium, which was the largest indoor space in Crestwood, with what appeared to be most of the town and several hundred people who had moved away from Crestwood over the years and come back specifically for this occasion, which was the kind of attendance that told you everything you needed to know about 21 years of genuine service in a small place. The new principal gave a speech about what made Crestwood Elementary the school it was. She talked about the teachers. She talked about Miss Darlene's specific contribution to the culture of the school, her belief that the people inside a school were more important than its processes, and that the quality of the people would determine the quality of the outcomes if you hired correctly and got out of the way. Then she said she wanted to name one teacher specifically. She named Renata. She said, "There are teachers who teach curriculum, and there are teachers who teach children. Miss Osei has never once confused those two things, and every child who has sat in her classroom for the past 8 years knows the difference between them, because she taught it to them by example every single day." The room applauded. Caleb applauded loudly because Caleb applauded everything loudly. Jordan reached over and took Renata's hand and held it without saying anything, which was the specific, private language of a child who knows that some moments require presence rather than words. Across the room, Solomon saw this. He saw the family at the table, Renata, her sons, her parents who had driven from Atlanta, the table full of people who loved her and knew her, and he felt the full, unmanaged weight of everything that had been built without him. He He felt it without resentment and without self-pity. He felt it with the specific, earned gratitude of a man who has been allowed back to the edge of something he does not deserve and who understands clearly that deserving it is the work of every day from this point forward. Renata wrote in her journal on a Tuesday evening in November of the second year after Solomon arrived. She wrote, "I have been thinking about what it means to be right about something. Not right in the sense of winning an argument or having predicted correctly. Right in the sense that the thing you chose has turned out to be the true thing, the one that reflects how the world actually is rather than how you needed it to be. I was right to leave. I was right that the boys needed to know where they came from when the time was right. I was right that Solomon was capable of the work if the work was required of him by consequence rather than by request. I was right that Crestwood was real and that what I built here was mine. I was right that the man I married contained both the man who built the cage and the man who, given the loss of me as the consequence of the cage, would dismantle it. All of these things have turned out to be true. Being right about all of them did not make the doing of them easy or cheap or free of cost. It simply means that the cost was paid for something real." She read this back. She filed it beside everything else. She went to bed. In the morning she stopped at the broken traffic light and looked at the field and went. There is something worth saying about what Crestwood did for Renata that went beyond the practical. She had arrived there knowing no one, carrying everything she had in a lockbox and a bag, in a situation that most people in the world would have experienced as isolation, cut off from family, from professional network, from every system of support she had built across 36 years of her life. She had expected isolation. She had planned for it. She had understood it as the cost of the safety she was buying, and she had been prepared to pay it. What she had not planned for, and what she found instead, was that the act of showing up completely in a place and doing real work in it, and being exactly who you are inside it produces, over time, a form of belonging that is different from the belonging of a place where you were born or a community where you were known from the beginning. It is a belonging you earn through presence and contribution, and it is, for that reason, entirely yours in a way that inherited belonging sometimes is not. Crestwood had not inherited Renata. It had chosen her, over 8 years, through the accumulation of Tuesday mornings and October gardens and school board meetings and broken traffic lights, and the particular quality of a woman who showed up every single day and did the work and asked for nothing beyond what she had earned. She had chosen it back. The choosing had gone both directions. That was what made it real. She thought about this sometimes when the boys asked about Atlanta, about where she had grown up, about what it had been like before Crestwood. She told them about Atlanta honestly and completely, about her parents' house, about the streets she had grown up on, about Spelman and Emory and the years of building programs and the specific quality of the city she had loved. She told them about the conference where she had met their father, about the beginning that had been genuinely good. She told them all of it. And then she said, "Crestwood is home. It is home because I built it. It is home because you were born into it. It is home because the people here chose us, and we chose them back, and that choosing is the only thing that makes anywhere home." Caleb had nodded with the practical satisfaction of someone who has received a complete answer. Jordan had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is why you stop at the light every morning." She said, "Yes, that is exactly why." He had filed this in the interior place where he filed everything important and had not raised it again. He simply stopped at the light every morning too, when he was old enough to understand that stopping was the community's way of being itself, which meant it was his way of being part of it. He stopped without being told to stop. He stopped because the community had decided it was right, and he was a member of the community, and members do the right thing. It was, in this sense, the most complete thing his mother had ever taught him, and she had not taught it through instruction but through example, which was the only kind of teaching that lasted. Solomon kept the photograph on his desk at the new house, the same one he had carried for 10 years. Renata laughing at the farmer's market, both hands raised holding a pineapple, her whole face taken over by the laugh, completely unaware she was being captured. He had kept it through the grief and the selling of the company and the starting over and the 7 years of cemetery visits, and it sat now in the new house in the same position it had always occupied, close enough to see without turning away from the work. Darius had noticed it on a visit and said, "You kept that." Solomon said, "I always kept it." Darius said, "I know." He had not said anything else. Some things are understood between men who have been friends since they were 19 without being said. Solomon kept the photograph because it was the beginning. The moment before everything became complicated. The moment when she was simply herself, and he had been present enough to see it, and quick enough to capture it, before she could protest. He kept it as a standard. He looked at it every morning before he started the day. He looked at it and remembered who she had been before he made her smaller, and he used the remembering to understand what he was still working toward. Not possession, not resumption, not the reconstruction of what had been. Simply the earning, one day at a time, of the right to be in the same room with someone who laughed like that. He went to work. Before we close, I want to say something clearly, because this story makes it easy to organize things into a simple shape. The bad man, the brave woman, the happy ending waiting just around the corner. That shape does not fit this story, and I am not going to make it fit. Solomon Grant was not a villain. He was a man who loved Renata genuinely and deeply, and whose love expressed itself, over 5 years of marriage, as the systematic removal of her autonomy, the financial monitoring, the communication surveillance, the social management through small, sincere, concerned interventions in her friendships, the professional override of her authority inside her own work, the phone call to Gloria. He did none of these things through cruelty. He did all of them through the complete, sincere, unexamined belief that his love entitled him to manage the person he loved, that the intensity of his care for her justified controlling the conditions of her life, that protecting someone and owning someone were the same activity. He was wrong about this. He was wrong in ways that cost Renata everything she had built before she met him and required her to stage her own death to escape. The sincerity did not reduce the cost. The love did not cancel what it required of her. Both things were true simultaneously, and they have to be held together because holding them apart allows everyone to be comfortable in ways that are not honest. In the United States, a woman is killed by an intimate partner every 72 minutes. Not injured, killed. The majority of those killings are preceded by documented patterns of coercive control. Coercive control is the pattern most consistently associated with intimate partner violence that becomes lethal. It is practiced, in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, by people who believe they are being loving and protective. The belief does not reduce the harm. The sincerity does not reduce the harm. The harm exists in the outcome. A person whose choices have been progressively narrowed, whose access to her own judgment and money and relationships has been systematically reduced, who has been made smaller inside a life that was supposed to make her more fully herself. Nearly 80% of domestic violence cases in the United States involve financial control as a primary mechanism. Renata Was, a woman with a master's degree and 10 years of professional experience building healthcare programs, had access to less than $400 of genuinely independent money in a marriage to a man who ran a multi-million-dollar company. She built the rest of what she needed over 9 months from sources his monitoring system did not capture. She was exceptional, educated, professionally connected, with planning capacity and a contact in the right organization and the specific technical knowledge to design a credible scene on a mountain road. And she still had to fake her death to be free. Sit with that. Then think about the women who do not have what Renata had. Less education, less money, less time, fewer contacts. No Clara and no Dr. Abernathy and no Burl and no Marvel and no Lockbox and no second car at the trailhead. They are inside these situations right now. They are navigating the same machinery with fewer tools and a system of support that is still insufficient for what they face. The research is clear about this. The outcomes are documented. The gap between what these situations require and what the available systems provide is real, and it is not improving fast enough. This is not a political position. It is a fact that sits in the same peer-reviewed literature as every other fact in this reflection. It deserves to be said clearly and without softening every time a story like this one is told. Renata drove to school every morning on the road with a broken traffic light. She had been driving this road for 8 years. She had stopped at the light every morning for 8 years on the principle that stopping was what everyone in Crestwood had agreed, without a meeting or a vote or a sign, was the correct thing to do. Some mornings she sat at the light for a few seconds longer than necessary and looked at the field on the left side of the road that changed with the seasons, green in spring, gold in late summer, bare and gray in winter, and in October going to a specific warm amber that caught the morning light in a way that was different from every other time of year. Some mornings she thought about the drive she had made 8 years ago, before dawn, in the opposite direction, with $6,000 and a lockbox and 2 children she was carrying who did not yet know anything. Some mornings she thought about what it had cost, and what it had produced, and whether the accounting was right. It was always right. The accounting was always right. She had done the most expensive and the most necessary thing available to her, and the result was in the back seat. 2 people arguing about something real, Caleb at full volume and Jordan at his own pace. Both of them hers and both of them becoming themselves, which was the only thing she had ever wanted for them, and which was happening, every morning, on the road with the broken traffic light. She stopped. She looked at the field. She went. There was one conversation Solomon had with Jordan in the library that he has thought about many times since. It was not a dramatic conversation. It was the kind of conversation that matters specifically because it is not dramatic. Jordan was reading, Solomon was reading, the library was doing its Saturday afternoon library things around them. The specific, companionable quiet of a public space full of people choosing to be still in the same room. Jordan looked up from his book and said, without particular preamble, "My mother is very good at knowing when something is right." Solomon said, "Yes, she is." Jordan said, "She is careful about it. She does not say a thing is right until she knows it is." Solomon said, "Yes, that is true." Jordan said, "She knows about you. She just has not said it yet." Solomon looked at his son. He said, "What do you mean?" Jordan said, "She knows whether you are the right thing. She just needs enough time to be sure before she says it. That is how she does everything." Solomon was quiet for a moment. He said, "That is a very good way to do things." Jordan said, "I know. I do it the same way." He went back to his book. Solomon sat next to his son in the library and held that exchange carefully, the way you hold something that matters, and decided not to do anything with it beyond holding it. Jordan had told him that his mother knew. He was not going to act on this. He was going to continue showing up on Saturdays and Sundays, continue washing the dishes, continue standing at the basketball court, continue being present in the specific, non-demanding, patient way that was the only honest way he had left to be present. He was going to let her say it when she was ready to say it. He had learned, finally and completely, that the most important decisions in a life together were not his to make alone. Here is what I want to leave you with. Renata Was is teaching 3rd grade in Crestwood, Tennessee. She has a garden she planted herself that produces tomatoes better than any garden within 20 minutes of it. She has 2 sons who are building remarkable things with their lives. One who will design buildings. One who will spend his life understanding what people actually need and giving it to them. She has a community that knows her and that she knows in return, built across 8 years of showing up and doing real work and being exactly who she is without performing any of it. She has a life that is more completely and fully hers than anything she lived before. She built it from nothing with her own hands, and it holds. Solomon Grant is 20 minutes away. He comes every weekend. He washed her dishes last Sunday. He poured the basketball court level. He sits in the library on Saturday afternoons and makes space for his son's thinking without filling it with his own. He spent 4 years understanding what he did in the marriage before he had any reason to believe she would ever give him the opportunity to demonstrate that understanding. He is doing the work. And here's my question. Does the work count when the person you harmed was not present to see you do it? Does a man who genuinely changes, who does the therapy, who reads the research, who restructures his company to honor the work she built, who calls her best friend to understand the full extent of the damage, who funds the organization that saved her life, all of it before she came back, all of it without any indication she would ever come back. Does that man deserve what has not yet been given to him? Or does a woman who staged her own death to be free, who drove 400 miles alone with $6,000 and 2 children she was carrying, who built a life in a town nobody had heard of, and became in that life the most complete version of herself she had ever been? Does she simply get to have exactly what she has built, on exactly her terms, at exactly her pace, without any obligation to the man who made the building of it necessary? I do not know the answer. I have thought about it many times, and I have not found the bottom of it. I think Renata is the only person alive who gets to know the answer, and she is finding it out one Sunday evening at a time, one dish at a time, one October morning in the garden at a time. She is going at the speed of evidence. She has all the time she needs because she has built herself a life that is complete whether or not the next thing arrives. And that is the only position from which any of the next things are worth having. Tell me what you think. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me where you are watching from tonight, and tell me what you would do. Because this question has been sitting with me since I first found this story, and I have not been able to put it down. Mind Folktales is built for exactly this. For stories that sit with you after the screen goes dark and refuse to leave until you have had a real conversation with them. Subscribe right now if you are not already here. We have more coming that will go somewhere you are not expecting. We are genuinely glad you were here for this one. The traffic light in Crestwood still blinks yellow. Renata still stops at it every morning. She has been stopping at it for 8 years. She will stop tomorrow morning and the morning after. The boys are in the back seat. Caleb is explaining something about a building they passed. Jordan is watching the field on the left side of the road that goes gold in the October morning light. The light blinks. She stops. She looks at the road ahead. She goes. Every morning. She goes. Jordan still keeps the book. He has kept it since he was 4 years old, when he found it on the shelf with his father's name written inside the cover in his mother's handwriting. And he keeps it still, on the shelf in his room, where it catches the morning light. He has read it twice now. Both times he arrived at the ending and sat with it for a while. Both times he thought about what his mother had said about the protagonist, that his problem was not that the two things he loved were incompatible, but that he kept making one of them smaller so they would fit instead of accepting that both of them needed full-size space. Jordan is 8 years old and he is already understanding, in the quiet, interior, unhurried way he understands everything, that this is the most important thing there is to learn about love. He is going to carry it into the work he does. He is going to carry it into everything. He was becoming him. Renata had said it to Clara. He is becoming him. She said it the way a structural engineer says that a bridge is holding, not as a celebration, but as an accurate report from someone who knows how to read load. The bridge was holding. She was watching it hold. She was not going to tell him yet that she could see it. She was going to watch it hold for a while longer, because she had earned the right to take her time, and taking her time was how she had arrived at everything real in her life, and she was not going to stop now.